Now, when they met on Jekyll Island, it was very clear in their mind that they were creating a central bank. But they had a problem, what to call it, because Congress was already on record as saying they did not want a central bank in America. I don't think the congressmen really understood what that meant, but they had heard the phrase, and they knew that that's what they had in Europe. And they said, no, when it comes to banking reform in America, we want something that's unique to represent our unique political and economic system. So a central bank was out. So what to call this central bank so that no one will know? And they talked about this on Jekyll Island. And this is what they concluded. They said, first, let's use the word federal to make it seem like it's a government operation. Secondly, let's add the word reserve to make it seem like there are reserves somewhere, like it was a banking concept. Third, let's add the word system. And this was very important, far more than we might think today, because remember, the major concern was this concentration of financial power in New York. And they had to sell the American people on the idea that this was a diffusion of power over a system of banks. And so they talked about 10 regional banks, and finally they said, no, that's not enough. We'll have 12 regional banks and diffuse the power away from New York, or at least make it appear that way. And they'll build those big buildings in all these regions, and the local yokels can come and look at the buildings and say, golly, we got one of them out here too. You know? And the impression was that because these buildings were out there, that the power was pulled away from New York and diffused throughout a system of Federal Reserve banks. Well, as you've heard said many times by now, what we wound up with was not federal, there are no reserves, it's not a system at all in the sense of diffusion of power, and the Federal Reserve banks aren't even banks. So on all four words, we're dealing with appearances of the fourth kind. Brilliant strategy. The next step was to sell this creature to the American people. And the first draft of the Federal Reserve Act was called the Aldrich Bill, sponsored by Senator Aldrich, of course. And this was against the good advice of Paul Warburg, who said, Nelson, if you put your name on this bill, it's going to get voted down in Congress because you are so closely identified with the power of big business. It'll be voted down. And apparently, Aldrich's ego was too big. He must have said, well, no, after all, I'm respected in the Senate, and I am the chairman of the National Monetary Commission. And for whatever reason, he insisted on having his name on it. I think he wanted to go down in history as the originator of the Federal Reserve System. But Warburg was right. Voted down, thumbs down right away, because he was a representative of big business. Well, this was a minor setback. They took their bill, they scrambled the paragraphs around a little bit, they took Aldrich's name off of it, and found a couple of Democrats to sponsor the bill. Now this was different. See, Aldrich was a Republican, and everyone knew that the Republicans represented big business. But they also knew that the Democrats represented the common man, the little guy, the fellow on the assembly line, you know, like Ted Kennedy. So they found a couple of millionaire Democrats to sponsor the bill. They got Carter Glass from the House and Senator Robert Owen, who was a very successful banker. And now they sponsored the bill. It was the Glass-Owen bill, and this was different. This was a Democrat bill, and it began to receive very popular consideration in Congress. Next, Aldrich and Vanderlip began to give speeches and statements to the press condemning the bill that they had written. They said, this will ruin the banks. This will be terrible for the nation. And by the time this was printed in the newspapers, the average person read that and said, oh, I guess the big bankers don't like this bill very much. It must be pretty good.